Fleur, and I'm joined by my co-host and longtime friend Sachi. We're second career landscape designers and bring our life experience and a fresh perspective to designing gardens.
And I'm Sachi, and you're listening to the On Garden Design podcast, where we chat about what makes a garden great, and we try to inspire and make designing accessible to anyone interested in gardens. So what are we talking about today?
It's just a really exciting day today because we have a special guest joining us. We have Sue Stuart-Smith, and she's a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, and author of The Well-Gardened Mind, a Sunday Times bestseller and gardening book of the year, and now printed in 18 languages, and also in an audio book format, which is read by Sue herself. Now, we've invited Sue on today because her book is groundbreaking and it analyses the relationship between gardening and mental health. This is a topic we think that a lot of our listeners will resonate with. So we're going to really unpack how to design gardens that have therapeutic benefits. So welcome to the studio today, Sue. It's just delightful to have you here.
I'm thrilled to be joining you.
It's great to have you, Sue. And I think it's really interesting, having reflected a little on this topic in preparation for this interview. This really comes to, it's probably something that lots of us have intuitively felt when we're out in our gardens, but it's really nice to hear it actually articulated, and there's a bit of, research and science behind what we all know is so good about gardening. So I'm going to start with the first question for Sue, which is, what led you to make the connection between gardening and its therapeutic effects?
Well, I think it's something that crept up on me quite slowly, actually. I married my husband, Tom Stuart-Smith, who's now a celebrated garden designer, well over 30 years ago. And at that point, I have to confess, I rather saw gardening as something a bit like outdoor housework, except nicer to be outside rather than inside. I loved nature, I loved walking in nature, but I hadn't experienced gardening before. He was obviously already a very keen gardener and quite knowledgeable plantsman. So I kind of tagged along with him, and we started making a garden around our home, which was a big endeavour. It was on a stony, windy field, so it was quite tough. It wasn't the best introduction necessarily to gardening.
It wasn't romantic gardening.
No. And then when our youngest child was 5 and started going to school, I sort of felt, I'd really like a little plot of my own to have a go at this. And I've always loved cooking. And so I set up a little herb garden. And that was the beginning for me. I just got such a buzz from particularly sowing seeds, watching them germinate, the sort of speed of change that you get with annual sowings, and being able to harvest and bring these things into the house. So that was my first phase, if you like. And it was very much about productivity and the kind of buzz you get from that, because I went on to grow vegetables and other things that I could cook with. Then I would say about 10 years later, I went through a very, very stressful time at work. By then I was a consultant in the NHS. The hospital I was working for, the trust I was working for, went through a phase of reorganisation and cutting and so on. And I began to notice that when there was a weekend that I hadn't been gardening out in my veg plot, I was going back into work carrying so much more of the accumulated stress from the previous week.
I think we can all relate to that.
Yeah,
absolutely.
But I kind of hadn't necessarily noticed it until I was under quite extreme stress. I experienced that myself, if you like, and I'm very much drew on that in writing the book. But also in the back of my mind was my grandfather's story, which I'd grown up hearing from my mother. He was a prisoner of war as a very young man in Turkey during the First World War. And it was really having the opportunity to enroll on a year-long course of horticultural rehabilitation in 1920, which gave him his life back. And one of the things I wanted to do in researching the book was to find out more about that and to find out where he had that life-changing experience. The answer is it all happened on a number of different levels.
Yeah, it's I think often something organically grows like that, but then of course you've got that psychiatric training that then started to say, well, let's look at the science behind this.
Absolutely.
So
yes,
you intuitively
that was
felt
really important to me, yeah. I began to look at what was out there, what had already been written.
And was there much of that?
There was a bit, yeah, but I felt it didn't go deep enough. And some of it felt a bit, it was saying all the right things, but it felt a bit superficial, sort of a bit simple. I really wanted to understand why and how gardening can help change people's lives, because I really do believe that. I think there's nothing like gardening for helping people through a major life transition or recovering from a bereavement or a trauma. Other things can help too, but gardening has a unique kind of power.
Yeah, so what is it that is that power in the garden that people can only get from a garden? We can't get from medication or other interventions.
Or actually other forms of therapy. I mean, I think, I'm not a one-size-fits-all person. And I do think at different times in life, people can benefit from different things. So I wouldn't say those things can't, those other therapies. And I am a psychotherapist, so I practice talking therapy, and that's very important form of help too. But I think gardening has a lot in common with creative therapies, arts therapies, for example. So there's an overlap with that. It also has a lot in common with sort of nature therapy, green exercise, whether that's hiking or taking young people on wilderness adventures. There's an overlap, and gardening sits between these two things. So you can get all the benefits of being in the outdoors, and you can get all the benefits of experiencing yourself as a creative person and seeing the outcome of your efforts. But what gardening has that's, I think, unique is the quality of relationship that you form with the plants that you're tending, with the place, with the garden itself. That in itself can be very stabilizing, particularly if people have been uprooted. And I think there's a sort of intimacy that people can experience in the garden. And it's not a human intimacy. And it gives us a bit of respite from the complexity of human relationships. It's a living being. We're connected to the web of life. And not just the plants, but all the other forms of life in the garden. And that's enormously important. Many people actually get something quasi-spiritual through their gardening. I mean, for some people it is the link to God. Others have said to me, I interviewed a lot of people in the course of writing the book. One woman said to me, I feel connected in the garden. I feel connected to the earth. And then she paused and she said, no, I feel connected to the universe.
Oh, that's lovely. I like that.
Yeah.
And so if we go into a bit of what you actually outline in your book, you explore how both gardening is a process, but also the things in a garden can help people with different mental health issues. Could you walk us through some of those findings just to give the listeners a bit of a sense of what it is that you specifically identified?
Well, I think it's quite hard to summarise.
Yeah, I know. There's so much in this.
Gardening really does help people on many, many different levels. I think perhaps one of the simplest ways is through a concept that I developed, which is about seeing gardening as a form of space-time medicine. So let's start with space. The crucial element of the garden is that it's set apart from its surroundings. It's a kind of in-between space. It sits between the home and the outside world, whether it's countryside or city. If it's a hospital garden, it's very much between the hospital and maybe the car park that's beyond. You have this green space, sanctuary space. Often gardens are enclosed, and obviously the derivation and the word garden is enclosure. So when you enter a garden, you're entering another world. And that sense of safety that people can experience within that, and a kind of holding. Psychologically, psychotherapists use the term holding for a kind of emotional holding, a bit like a mother will hold a distressed baby. And people can feel held in a garden. They can feel protected, yeah?
Yes.
And And that's really the foundation of everything therapeutic that can happen in a garden. You need to create that feeling. There are many ways of doing it. In the UK, we have a lot of walled gardens, for example. They're part of our heritage. Most English country houses had walled gardens. It's where the vegetables and fruit were grown because they created this warm, protected space. It doesn't have to be a walled garden, but they do make very, very good therapeutic gardens. So that's the element of the spatial element. And within that, prospect and refuge. Yes. So within the different elements of design, you need areas that feel more protected and more refuge-like, areas where people can experience prospect. They've got vistas and views. Let's come on to the time part of it, which is equally important. So if we think about past, present, future, I'm going to start with future because I think that's actually one of the most powerful aspects of gardening, because gardening is intrinsically forward-looking. When you sow a seed, part of your mind is engaged in thinking 3 months ahead or 4 months ahead. You're thinking about the flowers you're going to pick, the produce you're going to harvest. There's a sense of positive anticipation that comes with that. And that leads on to other things like a sense of purpose, a sense of motivation. It's all linked up with our dopamine system in the brain, which is our kind of energizing, motivating neurotransmitter. So that forward aspect looking of gardening is intrinsic, I think, to the benefits of working with plants. When people are depressed, when they're very anxious, or if they've suffered a trauma, the future's very problematic. It's very hard to think of the future in a positive way. And gardening can give people a very simple way of beginning to do that, to begin to get into the habit, and to feel they can shape a bit of their world. In terms of the present moment, gardening can be a mindful activity. We get immersed in what we're doing. We can experience a sense of flow. And this is a very replenishing state for the brain. It also gives us a break from our ruminations or our sort of repetitive thoughts, or our self-critical inner voice. We get lost in something, and there's enormous value in that.
That one really resonates with me. I can spend hours, and you look up from what you're doing and you've been in that flow and mindful state, and you just kind of, I'm back in the real world.
And time has passed.
That's right.
You have no idea how much time's passed.
That's exactly right. Exactly. And your partner's going, are you coming in one time today?
You often hear beekeepers talk about that. When they're with their bees, they just go into this other world, and they're kind of mesmerized. They're totally mindful about what they're doing.
Yeah. That sense of immersion is very, very helpful. And I mentioned the past as well, not to forget that. Mm-hmm. So gardens can be a link to memories, to our childhood, to our parents, to our grandparents, and so on.
Yes.
So there can be a wonderful sense of continuity through gardening. And for example, in conditions like Alzheimer's, we know that introducing gardens and plants into care homes, for example, has a calming effect on people with dementia. They need less medication, they're less agitated. They feel a bit less confused. And this is often because they're familiar plants. They wouldn't necessarily be able to name them, but the part of the brain that recognizes and holds those memories is still active.
Sounds a bit like music, and it's
absolutely. I think it's very similar to that. Yeah. Yeah, that it's operating at another level.
I saw a clip on a show where there was a charity group taking in bantam chickens into a retirement village and just having the chickens sit on someone's lap, and it brought, I think it was a triggering of happy memories, almost childhood memories of playing with chickens in the backyard. Yeah.
Just an extension of that to a pot plant, don't you? You can have a pot plant sitting on the lap.
Or maybe, when the hydrangeas bloom.
Yeah, that's
right. Sort of like that was
that's right. All the rose and the scent, and
it's a happy sea of place.
That's right.
Yeah.
What about just going back to care homes, people are uprooted and put into a care home and nothing's familiar.
Yes.
But the plants in the garden may be the only thing that is familiar.
And then I guess as people lose sight, and with these sensory smells are really powerful.
Very, very important, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy that a lot of our areas that really are in demand to supporting people in difficult stages in life, whether that's trauma in hospitals, in care homes, are some of the most depleted green spaces that you see.
They're so institutional. They don't actually think about the environment so much and how that might affect recovery.
And this is where hopefully this conversation can really start to trigger a little bit more of that, hey, what can we do for those that we care for in a position when they're not able to do what they otherwise would like to do. Now, actually, so we're still on that sort of question there, and we talked about some of the processes there. What are some of the things in a garden that would also help people with different mental health illnesses? It's like, the items, the tangible things in a garden.
I think it's quite difficult to generalise, actually. I think the general rules of thumb are to have plenty of greenery, not too much hard space.
Mm-hmm.
I uncovered some research showing that high levels of biodiversity was linked with greater levels of restoration. So I think biodiversity, complexity, seasonal change, these are all things that engage us, pull us in, help get us into a habit of noticing things. I think it's important to have quiet spaces where you can sit and be in nature. I think if you can include water, that's wonderful. It's not necessary, but it can make a huge difference. We all know the sound of running water is very soothing.
Yeah.
And these kind of sounds, the wind in the trees also, they help trigger alpha rhythm in the brain, which is a sort of more calming state.
You've just explained something to me. I love the sound. We have a native tree called a casuarina, which is like a pine, and it has a very particular sound in the wind. And I love that sound. So you've just explained to me what I do. That's great.
But I also think it's important to emphasise that it isn't one size fits all. Because there's a whole chapter in my book on hospital gardens and, care homes and things like that. And I describe 2 gardens in a residential setting. They're each attached to different units. One is for people with young adults with very severe learning disabilities. And these are on the autistic spectrum with no language, so very, very profound level of autism. The one next to it is a centre for a different kind of learning disability for people who lack sensory stimulation and who become agitated. So their brains are understimulated a lot of the time, and they become agitated, seeking stimulation. So these are opposite kinds, if you like, of issues. And the gardens in these 2 settings were designed actually by a practice that's based in New Zealand, someone called Gail Suter-Brown. I don't know if you've come across her, Greenstone Designs. But the gardens are based in the UK. And the garden for the severely autistic people is very rectilinear. It has minimal seasonal change because any change is very disturbing. Yes. Yeah? And there can't be sort of hidden places in the garden and things like that. So this is a very simple plan, very green, not even berries, just a soothing green outdoor space. And that is very effective. If you're the right person in that space. Yeah. The other garden couldn't be more different. Right. It's curvilinear, it's a sensory garden. There's wind chimes, there's water, there's sand, there's still going on. Lots of different textures, lots of smells, bugs and bees, exactly. Yeah. In life, teeming with life. Yeah. It's interesting. And teeming with opportunities to seek different forms of sensory stimulation. Now, of course, these are quite extreme examples, but I use them to illustrate that it really isn't one size fits all. If you're thinking about a garden as a health intervention, you really got to understand who it's for and what their needs are. You can't go in with any assumptions.
Yeah, because, we often have this sort of term mental health issues, and within that, there's so many different types, and it's a huge spectrum. So what you're saying for those suffering autism, I mean, even in the spectrum of autism, there's different.
Of course. I mean, this was a very, very profound.
And other sort of PTSD or veteran trauma.
Yeah.
Or even anxiety and burnout. You're going to have different things again.
Yeah. So how do we know? How do we know what the right
What think about as garden designers? If we're designing gardens for people who have particular mental health conditions, are there any guiding principles or things we should be thinking about?
Well, I think the first thing is, as I said, to understand who you're making it for. Yes. And then getting a balance between maybe areas of the garden that are about doing, the active gardening, and areas of the garden that are about simply being in the garden, a place where you can sit alone or sit quietly and chat with relatives or friends who are visiting you, say in hospital. A garden in a hospital kind of benefits everybody, not just the patients. It's the staff, it's the relatives, it's everybody.
Now, I just had that thought, I was slightly a sort of sidetrack, but we both heard Stephen Wells talk in Landscapism in Sydney recently, and he gave some great examples, many of them which were living, physical gardens. But he also gave examples where if it wasn't possible to put in an actual plant or something living, he put in murals and implications of plants.
Yes.
So how does that work?
Well, that's very interesting, isn't it? I think anything is better than nothing when it comes to the evocation of nature. So, in hospital, it's been shown that having a view through a window helps people, of trees, for example, helps people get out of hospital a bit quicker. They need less pain relief and so on. But equally, having a large picture on the wall, maybe an image of trees, for example, can do the same thing. So I think, we should... I don't think we'll go too far down the virtual nature route, because I don't think it's as powerful as the real thing.
Yeah. It's probably a great fallback if it is a situation where you just can't have something living.
Absolutely, yes. And hospitals are often like that.
The sterile nature, absolutely can't bring in any other
it has to be, yes. Yeah.
I guess one of the things I'm really interested in, and particularly Sue, because you came to this without being a gardener, do you have any suggestions because we know gardening is great for the soul.
Yeah.
How can we encourage people who are not gardeners or not interested in gardening to become interested or to engage more? Because it's going to be
for their own good.
That's right.
I don't know. I don't think we should be going out there as missionaries. We're comes out to everybody.
But that's what we do anyway.
Yeah, it's
we're telling people
we have a wide church here.
That's right.
Yes, appeal to everyone.
I think you have to sort of lead by example, really. Yes. And when I was interviewing people on the research I was doing, visiting different kinds of projects, many people who said, I did this as a last resort. I didn't think it was going to do anything for me, but I was fed up with my mother going on about it, or my doctor said I had to do it. And I just did it because I just felt I just had no choice anymore. I'd tried so many other things. And lo and behold, it had helped them. So, there's no question that it can help people who are very sceptical. Equally, it can take quite a long time. Gardening is not a quick fix. We all know that. You have to work with the seasonal calendar. This is part of its benefits. You have to delay your gratification, Yeah.
Not usual in this world.
Not so usual these days. I interviewed one woman on an addiction project in Italy. She was in a very, very bad place. And she hated everything. She hated life. She hated the people around her. And she hated the gardening. And she hated it for about 18 months. Maybe not. Or maybe it's 12 months. So it was through a whole year. But the turnaround came. By the time 18 months had passed, she had turned around. And the thing that turned her around, actually, was a cluster of languishing cacti that somebody else had abandoned. And one day she spotted them and she thought, oh God, they need a bit of water. They're looking really sick. And she started looking after these cacti. And one day, one of them flowered. flower.
Brilliant.
A brilliant orange flower.
And I have to say,
And that was the moment that I think she's so engaged with it. And that was transformative for her. And she went, when I interviewed her, she was really, she said, for the first time, I'm experiencing the serenity of life. She'd had a very troubled life that has led to her addiction. And, she was beginning to think of a future for herself. But it took a long time.
Yeah, and a flower.
And a flower, look at that.
Which goes to you.
I mean, she was growing flowers in the nursery.
She was growing them, in fact.
Oh, yeah, no.
So it was either cumulative or it was this particular.
No, I think it's this particular thing that she rescued. I think it was very symbolic of herself, and she rescued that, and I think it helped her feel maybe she could rescue herself. Because, there's so many symbols and metaphors we can experience through gardening.
Yeah.
And all this goes on at an unconscious level.
So if gardeners have to embrace death in the garden, because things have a cycle and it's just part of the gardening experience. So if you're very traumatised where sort of that violence or death might be a trigger for you, how do you reconcile gardening in the cycle of gardening with, the therapeutic nature of what you're doing?
The truth is there's no escaping death anyway. And I think, gardening is a kind of kinder way maybe to experience it and to understand that it is part of life. So I think, and at the same time, we experience the continuity of life through the garden. So the transience of life on the one hand and the continuity of life on the other are kind of held in balance. And that makes it much easier for us, I think, to come to terms with what can be, as you indicate, really brutal realities, really traumatizing realities. And there's an American psychiatrist who was writing in the 50s who described how important it was for people dealing with a bereavement or their own mortality when they were dying to experience something that he called symbolic survival, which is a sense that, not everything is gone. Not everything will be gone. That can happen through religion, it can happen through creative activities, it can happen through having our children, as it were, the sense of the line going on. But what he described was that the strongest way people experience and the most common way people experience it is through nature, is through the continuity of the cycle of life. And that's why so often we plant a tree to commemorate somebody in their memory, things like this. Yeah, they're powerful symbols.
Yeah, they're powerful as symbols. Yeah, and so I guess when things have the cycle in the garden, it's forgivable. It's something that's not contributing to.
No, absolutely.
Then
for me, it's also we stop being so disconnected from the part of nature that we've become. And we see the cycles that actually happen to all of us too. And it sort of brings us back into our foundations as human beings, getting very deep and philosophical.
Yeah, we are biological.
That's right, exactly.
Absolutely. We're subject to the same laws of nature.
That's right, yeah.
Now, I just cannot let this podcast finish without having a little bit of an explanation from you on the microglia.
The microglia.
Oh, yes. I wasn't sure I was saying that right, because honestly, when I read that in your book, I was just mesmerised. I probably, got my captivated young teenage children, because I got them in the car and I gave them a big download on this, and I think they just couldn't wait to get out. But I thought it was so interesting. Can you share a little bit about that with our listeners and that connection with gardening?
Yes, absolutely. I was troubled when I was researching the book about the number of times that I encountered the metaphor of the brain being like a computer in neuroscience books, particularly popular ones, and even things like, this works a bit like an app in your brain.
I don't have any apps in my brain.
It's slipped into everyday language. We talk about being hardwired, don't we?
We do.
So it's there. It sort of seeps in. These metaphors sort of get under the surface, don't they? And if we think of ourselves as machines, that's really not a good way to go, because we're not. And then I came across the work, which is quite new and emerging, on these cells called microglia cells. They're part of our immune system. They're mainly active at night when they come out, and they weed and prune our synapses. They clear toxins from the brain. They basically keep our brain healthy. And each microglia cell actually has its own little bit of territory, has its own garden.
It's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. And they have a nickname of the brain's constant gardeners. And I really wanted to put that out there and for that to be better known. It's why sleep is so helpful to us, is so our microglia can get to work. And I loved that. And I think, the best metaphor for the mind and for the brain has to be the garden. Because we do have to tend our lives and our relationships. It's all part of care and nurture, actually, which is fundamental to gardening.
Absolutely. I love that.
So do I. I think that's probably a really great way to start to tie us up. But before we end, do you have any last words of wisdom, or particularly to give garden designers some advice or general listeners some wisdom? What would that be?
Oh, my goodness.
Not putting you on the spot already.
Well, just a general word of advice. Well, people sometimes say to me, should I plant this colour? Will this, is pink going to be better for people than yellow? And I think you've just got to go with what you love. Yeah, I have a particular passion for the colour blue. My delphiniums are blue. But, not everybody does. So there's no rules in a way. Go with what you love and go with what moves you.
Just give it a go.
And give it a go as well.
Not much to lose, do you?
That's the great thing.
And everything to learn.
Yeah, and gain.
That's right.
Lifelong learning.
Exactly. Exactly. As gardeners, we are lifelong learners. And I have to say, in this conversation, while you've reflected that we've, in our vernacular, we talk about ourselves more like computers, but we also have a lot of things in our general conversation that go to gardening, like growth and evolution, and all of these things kept on coming up as we were talking.
We sow seeds of ideas.
We do.
Absolutely. The bits you're doing all the time.
That's right. And I guess, it just struck me as I don't think we are conscious about how much nature, and obviously gardens by extension, are a part of us as a species. That's a very deep note to finish on, isn't it?
But, it's been such a wonderful journey to have this conversation with you, Sue. So thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sure our listeners will be just champing at the bit to go and to buy your book, The Well-Gardened Mind. Now, just a note for I know in Australia it has sold out, but it'll be back on bookshelves in May.
Yeah. But this is an ebook.
It is an ebook.
It is an audiobook.
That's right. And we can order books from other places in Australia. So.
That's right. And I also wanted a particular thank you to Sue, because we have improvised our studio. So it might be sounding a bit different today. We're actually in my kitchen and we have a very interesting arrangement of microphones. So thank you so much, Sue, for going with our improvisation. It's much appreciated. But we might wrap up there. And if you would like to hear us on the next episode, you can find us on Spotify, find us on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcast. Follow us so that you know when we are on next. And we will talk to you again next time. Thank you. Thanks for now. Bye.
Thanks, Sue.